courtroom was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like everyone's holding their breath without realizing it. Sunlight slanted through tall windows, catching dust motes that floated lazily above rows of wooden benches. The air smelled faintly of old paper, floor wax, and coffee that had been sitting too long. It was just another Tuesday morning in the county courthouse, the kind of place where most people only showed up when they had no other choice. At the front of the room, behind a high bench that seemed to hover just above everyone else, sat the judge. He'd been on the bench for nearly a decade, and though he tried to stay patient, the endless stream of parking tickets, noise complaints, and small-time disputes had worn him down over the years. He moved quickly through cases, efficient but not unkind, just tired. His notes were neat, his rulings consistent, and his goal was simple: clear the docket before lunch. Then she walked in. She was older, well into her 70s, maybe even her 80s, with silver hair pulled back in a loose bun and a faded floral dress that looked like it had seen better days. She leaned on a wooden cane as she made her way slowly down the aisle, her steps careful but steady. She didn't look nervous exactly, more like resigned, like she'd been here before or somewhere like it, and knew how things usually went. The clerk called her case, a traffic violation for failing to signal a lane change on Elm Street 2 weeks earlier. A routine matter, barely worth writing down. The officer who issued the ticket gave a short statement, clear by the book, and sat back down. The judge glanced at the woman, expecting the usual. A plea for leniency, maybe a story about rushing to the doctor or not seeing the officer, perhaps a promise to be more careful next time. But she didn't say any of that. Instead, she stood straighter, set her cane gently against the side of the podium, and looked the judge right in the eye. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm and clear, "I understand the citation was issued in good faith, but I believe there may be a legal issue with how the violation was recorded." The judge blinked. That wasn't the script. He leaned forward slightly. "What do you mean?" She didn't fumble, didn't stammer. She spoke like someone who'd done this 100 times before. According to Section 1432 of the Municipal Traffic Code, a lane change violation requires either video confirmation or a second officer's verification if the stop occurs more than 500 feet past the infraction site. Officer Daniels pulled me over nearly 800 feet down the road, and there was no dashcam footage cited in the report. A murmur rippled through the small crowd. Even the bailiff raised an eyebrow. The judge stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at the ticket. Sure enough, no dashcam, no second officer. Just a handwritten note and a timestamp. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am, while that's noted, the fine for this offense is minimal. $45, you can pay it today or request a payment plan. Given the circumstances, I'm inclined to let it stand." She didn't argue, didn't sigh or roll her eyes. She simply nodded. "Understood, Your Honor. May I file a motion to reconsider? I'd like to submit a brief on the matter." Now the judge was truly surprised. Most people didn't even know what a motion was, let alone how to file one, especially not without a lawyer. "You're representing yourself?" "Yes, sir. And you've studied law?" She gave a small, almost shy smile. "Not formally, but I've read a lot over the years." He hesitated. Part of him wanted to wave it off, move on to the next case, keep things moving. But something in her tone, the precision of her words, made him pause. "All right," he said finally. "You have 10 days to submit your motion. Clerk will give you the forms." "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, picking up her cane. As she turned to leave, the courtroom stayed silent. Even the usual shuffling and whispering stopped. People watched her go, not with pity or impatience, but with something closer to curiosity. Who was she? Where did she learn to talk like that? Back at the bench, the judge made a note in the file, not just about the motion, but about her. Something about the way she'd cited the code, the quiet confidence, the lack of anger or desperation. It didn't fit. Most folks came in defensive or scared. She'd come in prepared. Later that afternoon, while reviewing case files in his office, he pulled up her record. No priors, no traffic violations in over 20 years, no attorney listed. Just a single address in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town, the kind of place with front porches and well-kept gardens. Nothing stood out except that one detail. She'd requested a motion form like it was second nature. He almost dismissed it as a fluke. Maybe she'd looked up the law online. Maybe she'd gotten help from a neighbor. but deep down he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than met the eye. 2 days later, a manila envelope arrived at the courthouse clerk's desk, hand-delivered. Inside was a 3-page motion, typed on an old typewriter, slightly uneven margins, faded ink, but impeccably organized. It cited not just the municipal code, but 2 recent appellate decisions that supported her argument. It even included a hand-drawn map of Elm Street, marking the exact spot of the alleged violation and the location of the traffic stop. The clerk, who'd worked there for 15 years, stared at it like it was a relic from another century. Then she walked it straight to the judge's office. When he read it, he didn't just skim. He read every line, checked every citation, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of something he'd almost forgotten: respect. He hadn't just fined an elderly woman for a minor mistake. He'd brushed off someone who clearly knew the law better than half the attorneys who walked through his courtroom, and now he had a decision to make. But that was for another day. For now, he set the motion down on his desk, tapped his pen against it twice, and made a note in his calendar. Rehear case. Give her the floor. Because sometimes the quietest voices carry the clearest truth, and this one deserved to be heard. The courthouse buzzed with a different kind of energy the morning of the rehearing. It wasn't packed. This wasn't a murder trial or a celebrity scandal. But more people showed up than usual for a simple traffic matter. Word had spread quietly among the clerks, the bailiffs, even a few local attorneys. That older woman who'd filed the motion? She'd done it properly. Not just properly, impressively. Some said she'd cited case law like a seasoned lawyer. Others whispered she might have been a lawyer once, long ago. No one knew for sure, but curiosity had a way of filling empty benches. She arrived early, just like last time. Same floral dress, same wooden cane, same calm expression. She didn't look around for attention or nod to anyone in particular. She simply took a seat near the front, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. The judge watched from his chambers through the small window in the door. He'd read her motion 3 times now. Each time he found something new, a subtle reference to a 2021 appeals court ruling about procedural fairness, a footnote explaining why the signage on Elm Street didn't meet state standards for lane change enforcement zones. It wasn't flashy. It was thorough, thoughtful, the kind of work someone did when they truly cared about getting it right, not just winning. When court was called to order, the room hushed instantly. The judge took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and looked down at her. "Ma'am," he began, "you filed a motion to reconsider your traffic citation. Would you like to speak to it?" She rose slowly, steadied herself on the podium, and nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." Her voice was soft but carried clearly in the quiet room. "I'm not here to argue that I didn't change lanes, I did. But the issue isn't whether I signaled. It's whether the citation itself was legally valid under current municipal and state guidelines." She went on, not with drama, but with clarity. She explained how the stretch of Elm Street where she'd been stopped had no proper signage indicating it was under active traffic monitoring. She pointed out that the officer's report listed the violation at 10:14 a.m., but the body cam footage, requested by her in a public records inquiry, showed the stop occurring at 10:18, nearly 800 feet past the supposed infraction. Under the law, that gap mattered. Without video capturing the actual moment or a second witness, the citation rested on memory alone. And memory, she noted gently, isn't evidence. It's recollection. A few lawyers in the back exchanged glances. One scribbled something in a notebook. The judge asked questions, not to trip her up, but to understand. "You mentioned the signage. Did you measure the distance yourself?" "I did," she said. "With a measuring wheel I borrowed from the library's community tools program. I walked it twice." Someone in the audience let out a quiet chuckle. Not mocking, but amazed. Then came the moment no one expected. The judge turned to the officer who'd returned for the hearing. "Officer, did you check the municipal code before issuing the citation?" The officer shifted. "I followed department procedure, Your Honor." "But did you review Section 1432 specifically?" A pause. "Not word for word, sir." The judge nodded. He didn't scold. He didn't raise his voice. But the message was clear. Procedure isn't enough if it ignores the law itself. After both sides had spoken, the judge didn't rule right away. Instead, he said something unusual. "I'd like to take this under advisement." I'll review the motion, the footage, and the relevant codes. Court will reconvene in 1 week for a final ruling. As people filed out, a young law clerk lingered near the podium. "Excuse me, ma'am?" she said quietly. "How did you learn all that?" The woman smiled. "Books, lots of them. And time." Back in his office, the judge pulled out his state legal code binder, the thick, leather-bound one he kept for tough cases. He flipped to the traffic section, then cross-referenced it with the appellate decisions she'd cited. Everything checked out. Not only was her argument sound, it was generous. She hadn't attacked the officer or the court. She'd simply asked for fairness. That evening, he did something he hadn't done in years. He called an old law professor from his university days. "Remember that case from 19 about evidentiary gaps in traffic stops?" he asked. "The one where the court tossed the ticket because of timing and location issues?" "Vaguely," the professor said. "Why?" "I've got someone here who cited it perfectly. And she's not a lawyer." There was a long pause on the other end. Then maybe she should have been. The next few days passed quietly, but the story grew legs. A local reporter heard about it and stopped by the courthouse hoping for a quote. The judge declined to comment, pending ruling. But the clerk, unable to contain herself, said, "You should see her brief. It's better than half the ones we get from paid attorneys." Meanwhile, the woman went about her usual routine. She watered her garden, visited the library, and helped a neighbor fix a leaky faucet. She didn't talk about the case, didn't post about it online. To her, it wasn't about fame or proving a point. It was about principle, about showing that the law belongs to everyone, not just those with degrees or expensive suits. The day before the final hearing, the judge made a decision. He wouldn't just dismiss the ticket. He'd do it publicly, and he'd explain why, so others would understand that the system only works when it's applied fairly, even in small cases. But as he drafted his notes, another thought struck him. If she knew this much about the law, how much more did she know, and why had she stayed silent all these years? He didn't have answers yet, but he was starting to suspect this wasn't just about a $45 fine. It was about something much deeper, something the courthouse and maybe even the whole town had overlooked for far too long. When the final hearing day arrived, the courtroom was fuller than ever. Not because of drama, but because people sensed something rare was happening. A moment of quiet dignity meeting institutional power, and neither side shouting. She walked in the same way. Calm. Ready. And this time, when the judge spoke, his voice carried not just authority, but something softer, something like respect. The courtroom was still as the judge looked down at her from the bench. Sunlight streamed through the high windows again, but this time it felt warmer, softer, like the room itself was holding its breath. He'd just dismissed the ticket, not with a shrug or a routine stamp, but with careful words that honored the point she'd made, that even small laws deserve to be followed exactly, especially by those who enforce them. But instead of saying case closed and moving on, he paused. Then he asked a question no one expected. "Ma'am," he said gently, "if you don't mind me asking, where did you learn to read the law like that?" She didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands, wrinkled, steady, the kind of hands that had done a lifetime of work. Then she met his eyes again. "I studied it," she said simply, "a long time ago." The judge leaned forward slightly. "Were you ever a lawyer?" A quiet ripple went through the room. Even the bailiff stopped fiddling with his keys. She hesitated just for a second. Not out of shame, but maybe out of old habit. Like she'd spent years tucking that part of herself away and wasn't sure it was safe to bring it back into the light. "Yes," she said finally. "I was admitted to the bar in 1958. That got everyone's attention. 1958. Most of the people in that room weren't even born then. The courthouse itself had been rebuilt twice since." The judge's expression softened. "And you practiced?" She shook her head slowly. "Not really. I passed the exam, top of my class actually. But when I tried to join a firm, they told me clients wouldn't trust a woman to handle serious matters. One partner said I'd be better off teaching typing or raising children." She gave a small, wry smile. "I did raise children, and I taught myself everything else." She explained how she'd kept up with the law anyway, reading court opinions at the kitchen table after the kids went to bed, clipping articles about landmark rulings, writing letters to the editor about civil rights and fair housing. She never stopped thinking like a lawyer, even when the world told her she couldn't be one. I never stopped believing the law was meant to protect people, she said. Not just the powerful, not just the loud. Everyone. The judge was silent for a long moment. Around the room, people shifted, not out of boredom, but out of something deeper. Respect. Maybe even regret. Later that afternoon, a young public defender stopped by the clerk's office. "Is it true?" she asked. "About the woman from the traffic case?" The clerk nodded. "She showed me her old bar card. Faded but real. And she's been helping folks at the community center for years. Filling out forms, explaining tenant rights, even drafting wills for seniors who can't afford lawyers. Why didn't anyone know?" "Because she never asked for credit," the clerk said. "She just helped. Word spread beyond the courthouse. A reporter from the local paper wrote a short piece. Not a splashy headline, just a quiet story titled, 'The Lawyer Who Never Practiced.' It didn't go viral, but it landed in the right places. A retired judge read it over breakfast and called his old law school. A law professor shared it with her students as an example of quiet integrity, and at the county legal aid office someone printed a copy and pinned it to the bulletin board. Meanwhile, she went back to her usual life. She tended her roses, baked bread for a neighbor recovering from surgery, and walked to the library every Thursday. But now people looked at her differently, not with pity or curiosity, but with quiet admiration. The grocery store cashier asked if she'd ever thought about teaching. The postman thanked her for standing up for fairness. Then one rainy afternoon, there was a knock at her door. It was the young public defender, the one who'd heard the story and couldn't stop thinking about it. She stood on the porch holding a damp folder and looking a little nervous. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, "but I work with a program that helps law students understand real-world justice. Not just textbooks, but how the law affects people in neighborhoods like ours. We're starting a mentorship series, and I wondered if you'd be willing to talk to them. Just once." The older woman didn't say yes right away. She invited the young woman in, made tea, and listened as she explained how many students felt lost. Caught between legal theory and the messy human reality of courtrooms, evictions, and broken systems. "They need to hear from someone who sees the law as a tool for dignity," the defender said. "Not just a career." After a long silence, she nodded. "All right," she said. "But only if they promise to ask hard questions, and only if we meet in the library, not some fancy classroom." The first session was held 2 weeks later in the community room of the public library. 10 students showed up, unsure what to expect. They'd heard the rumors about the traffic case, the old bar card, the handwritten briefs. Some expected a stern lecture. Others thought it might be a history lesson. Instead, she asked them a question. "Why did you go to law school?" They gave the usual answers at first. To help people. To make a difference. To fight injustice. Then she leaned forward. "Good. But what will you do when the system asks you to cut corners? When your boss tells you a poor client's case isn't worth the time? When you're tired and it's easier to go along than to speak up?" No one answered right away. She didn't scold them. She told them about the years she spent watching courtrooms from the back benches, seeing people lose their homes or their rights, because no one explained the forms, because no one believed they mattered. "The law isn't just in books," she said. "It's in how you treat the person standing in front of you. Scared, confused, maybe wearing the same dress 2 days in a row because they're choosing between laundry and lunch." One student raised a hand. "But what if you're just one person? What can you really change?" She smiled. "You start by getting the small things right. Like a lane change, like a signature on a form, like listening, really listening when someone tells you their story." After the session, the students didn't leave right away. They lingered, asking questions about old cases, about how she stayed hopeful. She didn't have grand answers, just simple ones. Pay attention, stay kind. Don't let the system make you hard. Back at the courthouse, the judge heard about the meeting. He didn't say much, but he started reviewing his own rulings with fresh eyes, asking himself in every case, would she think this was fair? And in her quiet house, surrounded by books and the smell of cinnamon tea, she finally let herself believe that maybe her knowledge hadn't been wasted after all. Maybe it had just been waiting for the right moment, the right people, the right cause. Because sometimes the most powerful voices aren't the loudest. They're the ones that speak truth gently, patiently, and never stop believing that justice is worth fighting for, even if you have to do it alone. For decades, with nothing but a library card and a stubborn heart. The courthouse wasn't the same after that. It wasn't because of any big announcement or policy change, it was quieter than that. More like a shift in the air, the kind you feel before a storm or right after a long silence finally breaks. People started looking at each other differently. Not with suspicion, but with a little more care. Clerks double-checked forms before handing them out. Attorneys took an extra minute to explain things to clients who looked lost. Even the coffee in the break room seemed to taste less bitter. At the center of it all was her. She hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't stood on a soapbox or demanded recognition. But somehow, just by showing up as herself, sharp mind, steady heart and all, she'd reminded everyone what the law was really for. Fairness, dignity, and giving people a real chance to be heard. The judge noticed it most. He'd always prided himself on being fair, but now he saw how easy it was to slip into routine, to treat cases like items on a checklist instead of moments in someone's life. One afternoon, while reviewing a stack of eviction filings, he paused on a file that looked just like dozens he'd signed off on before. But this time, he asked the clerk to pull the tenant's full history. He called the landlord's attorney and asked if mediation had been offered. He even delayed the hearing by a week so the tenant could find legal help. It wasn't dramatic, but it was different, and it started with a simple question he'd begun asking himself. Would she think this was right? Meanwhile, the library sessions with the law students became a regular thing. Every other Thursday, she'd sit at a long wooden table surrounded by young faces full of questions, doubts, and that restless energy that comes from wanting to do good but not knowing how. She never lectured. Instead, she told stories about cases she'd read, rulings that changed lives, times when the law failed, and times when it quietly saved someone. One student asked her if she ever regretted not practicing law all those years. She thought about it for a long time. Regret's a heavy word, she said finally. I missed the chance to stand in courtrooms like I was trained to, but I never stopped using what I knew. I helped neighbors fill out disability forms. I wrote letters to landlords who tried to raise rent illegally. I sat with widows who didn't understand their rights. Maybe it wasn't real law to some people, but to those folks it mattered. That answer stuck with them. One student started volunteering at a senior center, helping with wills and power of attorney forms. Another began working with a nonprofit that translated legal documents into plain language. They weren't waiting to graduate to make a difference. They were doing it now in small human ways. Then something unexpected happened. The city council reached out. They'd heard about her work through the legal aid office and the library program. A new ordinance was being drafted about sidewalk accessibility for seniors and people with disabilities, and they wanted someone who understood both the law and real life to review it. Not as a consultant with a fancy title, but as a citizen with good sense. She agreed, but only if they let her bring along 2 of the students. They see things I don't, she said, and they'll be the ones living with these laws long after I'm gone. The meetings were held in a small room at City Hall, with folding chairs and a coffee pot that never quite stayed full. At first, the council members spoke in jargon, compliance thresholds, municipal liability, ADA integration, but she gently steered them back. What does this mean for Mrs. Lopez, who uses a walker and can't get from her door to the bus stop because of that broken curb? She'd ask. Or, if a senior falls because the sidewalk's uneven, is your ordinance going to help them, or just protect the city from a lawsuit? Slowly, the tone changed. The language in the draft got simpler. The timelines got more realistic. And for the first time, someone on the council suggested installing benches along the route. Not because the law required it, but because it was the right thing to do. Back at the courthouse, the judge invited her to observe a special session on elder justice, a new initiative to address scams, guardianship abuse, and housing insecurity among older adults. She sat in the back, as always, but when the discussion turned to legal forms that were too complex for many seniors to understand, he turned to her and said, "Would you be willing to help us rewrite them?" She didn't say yes right away. But the next week, she showed up with a notebook full of suggestions, short sentences, clear headings, examples in the margins. If someone's scared or confused, she told the team, the last thing they need is a wall of legal words. Her presence began to ripple outward. A local community college asked if she'd co-teach a short course on civic rights. A radio station invited her to do a monthly segment answering listener questions about everyday legal issues. No legalese, just plain talk. She said yes to both, but only if they kept it simple and focused on helping, not performing. Through it all, she stayed the same. She still wore her floral dresses. She still carried her wooden cane. She still made tea for anyone who came to her door with a question. Fame didn't change her because she didn't see any of this as fame. It was just responsibility finally being shared, and the judge? He started keeping a small notebook on his bench. Not for rulings, but for reminders. Things like, check signage before upholding traffic fines. Ask if the person understands their rights, don't assume they do. Slow down. Listen. One evening, as he locked up his office, he passed the courtroom where it had all begun. The lights were off, but he could almost see her standing there, calm, clear-eyed, holding nothing but truth and a cane. He smiled to himself. He hadn't just learned about a legal technicality that day. He'd remembered why he'd wanted to be a judge in the first place. Because the law isn't about power. It's about people. And sometimes the right person shows up at the right time, not with a shout, but with a sentence so true it changes everything. The courthouse steps were bathed in golden afternoon light the day they held the Community Legal Symposium. It wasn't a fancy event, just folding chairs on the plaza, a borrowed microphone, and a banner that read, "Justice for All, Voices from the Community." Most people expected the usual lineup, city officials, a few attorneys, maybe a judge or two giving polished remarks. But when the final speaker was introduced, the crowd leaned forward. She walked out slowly, cane in hand, wearing the same kind of simple dress she always did. No robe, no title, no fanfare, just her. The applause started small, polite, curious, then grew louder as people realized who she was. Not because she'd won a big case or made headlines, but because she'd shown up, again and again, for people who'd been overlooked. She didn't give a speech. She told a story. She talked about the first time she read the Constitution, not in law school, but as a teenager at the public library, sitting cross-legged on the floor because all the chairs were taken. She remembered how the words felt alive, like promises waiting to be kept. She spoke about the years she stayed quiet, not because she didn't care, but because the world told her her voice didn't belong in the rooms where decisions were made. But the law, she said, her voice steady and warm, doesn't live in courtrooms alone. It lives in grocery stores when someone gets overcharged and speaks up. It lives in apartment buildings when neighbors help each other read lease agreements. It lives in libraries, on park benches, in kitchen table conversations. Justice isn't just something judges hand down. It's something we build together every day in small acts of fairness. When she finished, there was silence for a heartbeat. Then the crowd rose. Not all at once, but like a wave starting in the back and rolling forward until everyone was on their feet. Not because she'd shouted or demanded it, but because they'd finally seen what had been there all along. Wisdom wrapped in humility. Strength dressed in kindness. Afterward, people didn't swarm her for photos or autographs. They waited in line quietly to say thank you. A young mother thanked her for helping her keep her apartment last winter. A retired teacher said her plain language guide to tenant rights had saved his sister from a scam. A teenager, barely 16, shyly handed her a notebook. "I want to be a lawyer," he said. "Will you look at my questions?" She took the notebook, smiled, and said, "Come by the library next Thursday." That became her new rhythm. Every Thursday, rain or shine, she sat at the same table in the library's community room. Sometimes it was just one or two people. Other times it was a dozen. They came with questions about custody, wages, wills, even how to write a letter to the city about a broken streetlight. She never gave legal advice, she was careful about that. But she explained how the system worked, what rights they had, and where to find real help. And always she listened. The judge visited once, not in his robes, just as a person. He brought 2 cups of tea and sat across from her like an old friend. "You've changed more here than I ever could in that courtroom," he said. She shook her head. "We both did what we could. You gave me a chance to be heard. That mattered," he nodded. Sometimes the most powerful thing a judge can do is stop talking and start listening. Months passed. The city adopted her suggestions for clearer legal forms. The community college made her informal mentorship a permanent part of its civic education program. Even the State Bar Association invited her to speak at a conference on access to justice, not as a keynote, but as a community elder with lived wisdom. She accepted, but only if they let her bring students with her. But her favorite moments weren't on stages or in meetings. They were quiet ones. Like the afternoon she sat on a bench in the town park, reading a recent Supreme Court decision out loud to a curious teenager who'd followed her from the library. He didn't understand all the words, but he listened carefully, asking questions like, "So does that mean they can't search your phone without a reason?" She explained it simply, using examples from everyday life, comparing digital privacy to locking your diary, or your front door, or the time she helped a group of seniors start a Know Your Rights club at the community center. They met every month, sharing stories, reviewing mail that looked suspicious, and practicing how to say, "I'd like to speak to a lawyer," without feeling ashamed. She never called herself a hero. She didn't want statues or headlines. What she wanted, what she'd always wanted, was for people to know they weren't powerless. That the law wasn't a wall meant to keep them out, but a tool they could use, if only someone showed them how. One spring morning, as cherry blossoms drifted down around the courthouse, a new clerk started her first day. On her desk, someone had left a small stack of papers, handwritten notes on common legal questions, with clear answers and kind reminders like, "It's okay to ask for help and your voice matters." At the bottom was a note, "For the next person who walks in scared." The clerk didn't know who E was at first, but by lunchtime she'd heard the story, and by the end of the week she'd started doing the same, leaving simple guides for others. That was the real legacy. Not fame, not titles, but a quiet chain of kindness, knowledge, and courage passed from one person to the next. And on most afternoons, if you walked past the park near the old oak tree, you'd see her there, silver hair catching the sun, cane resting beside her, a book in her lap, and often, a young person sitting close, listening as she read the law not like a rule book, but like a promise. Because justice doesn't always arrive with sirens and spotlights. Sometimes it shows up in a floral dress with a gentle voice and a stubborn belief that everyone deserves to be treated fairly, and that it's never too late to start.